Hello, welcome back, and we are here once again with Michael Ventura. And when we left off last time, we were in New York in the mid-60s. If I could choose any time that I would like to be in New York, it would probably be around this time. And so we're going to hear about that from Michael and what he was doing, what he was up to, and what his plans were. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, thank you for doing this again, and here we go. So in the mid-60s in New York, it was a very, very exciting place. It was still a basically workers' city. You had an upper class, but they were safely sequestered on the Upper East Side and in various neighborhoods, but basically it was a very alive city. It was dangerous, it was dirty, and it was still the biggest city in the world. It wouldn't be that for long. It still had the tallest buildings in the world. That wouldn't last for long. But it was an exciting place to be. And it was a city built on an idea of democracy that, flawed however it was still benevolent toward the working class. And by that I mean this. What other city in the world in the late 19th century would square off a lot of its most valuable real estate and build an enormous park so that everybody could share in the park? This being Central Park, which goes from 59th Street to 110th Street. That's roughly 2.5 miles long and roughly a mile wide, and has a skating rink and a zoo and lots of statues and museums around it. The museums, two of the greatest in the world, the Natural History Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Natural History Museum is on the west side of the park across the street, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art is on the east side of the park, right on the park on Fifth Avenue. And in those days, they were, as they were meant to be from the beginning of their design, free to the public. Great art, great science, open to anyone. Since then, you need a contribution to get in, and for a long time that's been modest. You could put in a quarter, but you had to put in something. But I think the Museum of Metropolitan Art is at least entertaining now fees and such, and memberships are very expensive. They didn't used to be. In any case, that was the kind of city that it was trying to be. I'm not saying it was that city, but that it was trying to be. There had been an enormous blackout in, I believe, 66.
65, I think.
And 65? Okay, thank you. And instead of the riots that would occur later, the city took it very calmly in this blackout, the first big blackout of a big major city in the post-industrial, or just about to be post-industrial world. And it was famous. Trains stalled under Harlem, for instance, when Harlem was all black. Kids came down into the trains and said, "Anybody need anything? We can go up and get it for you." And they did go up and get it for you. They weren't hustling. There was that feeling of everybody going through something. And the divides were not so divisive in New York. I think because, everybody rubbed shoulders on the subways. Maybe the very rich took taxi cabs, but people I know couldn't afford them. Everybody rubbed shoulders on the subways and on the buses. You couldn't avoid seeing people who were different, and no matter who you were. And it had a violent feel, but also a festive feel. Central Park was certainly festive, and though you wouldn't walk in it at night, most people, in the daytime, most everywhere, the park was fine and fun. And again, everybody mixing. There was softball, there still are, I hope. Softball, baseball courts and softball courts, diamonds, and you'd have amateur teams playing from all parts of the city, etc. The Shakespeare stage. So that was my city, and at some point let me go on with the city. So it's April 1968, and me and my girlfriend Antonia, I'm going to meet my friend Carl from Maine, and we were going to go to hear Janis Joplin and B.B. King at a nightclub in Greenwich Village. Janis Joplin was not yet big in the East, and B.B. King wasn't that well known in the East. So it was just a nightclub. It had a cover charge, not very expensive. On the way there, a kind of street telegraph took hold. I don't know how to explain it, but people started talking to people. Really, do you hear? And people, somebody, I don't know who, I don't know what race, came up to us and said, Martin Luther King's been shot. And it was an incredible blow. An incredible blow. It's hard to convey, because Martin Luther King had achieved. A lot of people talked. Bobby Kennedy talked. Other people talked. But he had achieved something amazing and had done it without violence. And the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, these were directly his creations, and the people whose shoulders he stood on, the very brave people who did what they did in the Civil Rights Movement. And we were shocked. We went to the nightclub because we didn't know what else to do. And we paid our cover charge. Nobody really felt like being there. Janis Joplin was standing around kind of stunned, like everybody. And she did a set, but it was really just kind of subdued. It wasn't what you'd normally expect of her. She was doing it because it was her job. And B.B. King came out, and he announced, because we just heard Martin Luther King had been shot, he announced that Martin Luther King was dead. And he just played his guitar for a while, and then left. Now, Carl was on his way to see his friend Henry, who was a black man who lived in Harlem. And he was dead set on going. That was the plan. He's going to stay over at Henry's. And he called Henry, and Henry told him how to get there. I told him he was crazy. The city was going to explode. Everybody expected the city to explode. The car was set on going. Well, it was amazing in New York City that night. The story is partly told, and the part that's told is true. But first, you have to understand that more than 125 cities in this country burned that night. All over the country, the South, the Midwest, the West, the East. City after city was rioted. Everybody expected New York to be the worst. And New York had a mayor John Lindsay, a big, tall, blonde Republican. In those days, there used to be something called liberal Republicans. And basically they had a liberal social platform and a conservative fiscal platform. And John Lindsay, as I say, was mayor. And he had been up to Harlem and to Bed-Stuy himself, not with a bunch of bodyguards, just with an aide and a couple of plainclothes cops before. They knew him. And he went up to Harlem. And if you read the accounts, it was him and a couple of plainclothes and an aide. And they got to 125th Street and got out of the car. And a big mass of people were coming toward them. And he spoke to the crowd. And they spoke to him. And as I said, they'd seen him before. It wasn't like this was a one thing and he was just going up there for the publicity. He was risking his life. And they understood that. He was showing respect for the people, and the people were showing respect for him. And that helps calm the thing. But the thing that really calmed New York was hundreds of neighborhood people in Bed-Stuy and in Harlem and other less well-known African-American neighborhoods walking the streets all night, trying to calm people down, trying to have them honor King by being nonviolent, and it worked.
Wow.
New York didn't burn.
Had there been riots prior to that, in the few years prior to that, like after 1965? Or?
There'd been almost riots. There was a riot in Bed-Stuy that also Lindsay walked into the middle of. That was the first one. There hadn't been anything as bad as elsewhere. And that was mainly because, for instance, Lindsay, the city government, had ordered the cops not to shoot at looters. Not to shoot unless they were getting shot at. And that made a big difference. I don't mean it just made a big difference in the body count. It made a difference to the people in the neighborhoods. Because they understood that, unlike Chicago, for instance, that was not going to be used to kill. That excuse was not going to be used to kill people or mow people down. That the city was really trying to save life. And measures like that made a difference. And in fact, the next 3 days, the murder count in New York was actually way down. That was a time when there was a lot of killing going on. Not gang killing, that didn't happen yet. But it was a dangerous city to walk around in at night. And the crime count was way, way down over the next 3 days. And that was a big thing to be part of. I mean, Antonia and I had to make our way back up to the Bronx. And that was an incredible sensation because you're in a subway and you're going north. At each stop, you don't know what's going to happen. And you don't know if the buildings are burning up on the streets above you. And the sense of this is happening to all of us, whether we like it or not. And the sense of anything could happen. And Antonia was a very beautiful young woman, beauty is a lightning rod, especially in that kind of tense, warlike atmosphere. And but we got home safe. The amazing thing is that Carl, he got to the subway in Harlem, and Henry was a big guy, and Henry was meeting him at the subway, and Carl was very, very, very blonde and very, very, very pale. He could be in the sun all summer and be pale. And yet, when Henry met him and people got angry, and Henry just said, "This is a friend of mine." Carl got in and he got out of Harlem the next morning. Okay. So there was that experience that I thought you'd want to hear about.
Yeah, and Lindsay ends up he ends up heading the subcommittee for civil disorders with the Polish guy from Chicago.
Yep, yep.
Yeah.
And then he wasn't. Lindsay was. I loved him. That's why I registered Republican when I turned 21 to vote for John Lindsay. That was my beginning as an American voter. I was a Republican. But he wasn't the people who don't like John Lindsay have their reasons. He wasn't a good administrator. And to be mayor of New York City, you have to be a good administrator. It's like being the leader of a small country. And a small country constantly in turmoil. And so he wasn't an effective administrator. He did serve 2 terms. But he was above and beyond the call of duty that night. And nobody ever forgot it. In fact, when he died around the year 2000, 2004, something like that, any obituary was about that. Now, the other thing he didn't do is he didn't use his position to become rich. Now we have a Senate and a House of Representatives of millionaires. Lindsay died fairly broke. And he didn't use his connections to become rich. He didn't go to be on the boards of corporations. He was old school. When President Truman was asked after his administration to offer a lot of money to write a memoir, he declined. He said he shouldn't make money like that on his office. In any case, that's what I mean by old school. In any case, so that was one thing. As my life changed, as my brothers, whom I had been supporting, got to be 18, they didn't have any, I was 18 when I first went to work and started supporting my sister and then my brothers as well. And my mother was working too. 1 and 2 bedroom place in the Bronx. But when my brothers turned 18 and they had no intention of working and contributing to the family, I was damned if I was going to support them in that project. I still was giving them money. I moved in with Antonia. I was still giving money, so I had to get another job, a better paying job than a radio TV, because a lot of my money went to my mother's household. But and I got a job typesetting, because in those days, if you could type fast and accurately in New York City, you could get a job. It was tougher in other cities because they wouldn't accept that men had typing jobs. Women were the office workers in other cities. When I went to Boston in '72, the employment agency didn't want to send me out for typing jobs because that was women's work. And when I was asked, why do you want this job instead of a man's job? I said, the only men's jobs you've got are outside, and it happens to be 5 degrees outside. I want to work inside. And they got me a secretarial job, which everybody thought was really weird. When I went in to apply for it, the people there thought I was weird or I was gay or I was something. But when I tested well. I made a good impression on the boss because he asked me to write a letter to him about why he should hire me. And I just figured it was going to be, I was just mad. And I wrote him an angry letter about why he should hire me. And he was surprised I had the moxie. And because I figured he was just going to show me the door. He was surprised I had the moxie for that, so he hired me. And but back to the sequence. So I'm working at radio at a place called Photocomp, which was in a cellar under one of the Radio City Music Hall skyscrapers, Radio City skyscrapers, and on 6th Avenue. The subway stop was on 6th Avenue. Now, this had 2 great impacts on me. One was that it was a very short walk from where the Modern Art Museum was at that time, in the 50s somewhere between 5th and 6th Avenues. It was a 10-minute walk from there. And I got a membership to the Museum of Modern Art, which at the time cost only $35, which was about a third of a week's pay. But still, I could save up for it easily, and I got the membership, which meant I could have my lunch hours at the Modern Art. And they had a very nice, modest, working people's cafeteria, and part of the tables were out with what they call the sculpture garden, with sculptures by Matisse and Picasso and other people with it, Brancusi. And it wasn't hoity-toity like the Modern Art became later. Again, it was reasonable for the people. If you wanted to and you were working stiff, making a modest salary, if you saved for a few weeks, you could get a membership. And the membership let you in anytime for free. So in the next year and a half, I spent a lot of time in the Modern Art, hours and hours a week. So I got out at 4, and sometimes I'd stay there. Sometimes I'd go on the weekend, spend hours there, and I got to know the paintings very, very well. And that was another thing about New York City in that time. This stuff was open. If you wanted it, you could have it. You didn't need a lot of money. You didn't need a fancy job. It was there. And New York had pretty much been designed that way at first, until, I don't know, 80s started to change. But I wasn't there anymore, so I can't tell you for sure. So, one night, and it was, the work week had pretty much ended, and it was summer, and my friend Duke, David Eric Rosenthal was his name. He died last June. And the people of the story I just told, Mark, Carl, and Tony, and Henry, they're all dead. It's weird to tell stories when there's nobody around who can say, no, Michael, wait, it happened like this. Remember the guy was like this and they said this? No. It's a strange feeling. In any case, so there was this festival going on in Woodstock, and it had opened. It was getting a lot of hype. Duke was 6'4", Jewish guy from the Bronx. I grew up in the projects, and Duke, he and I were very close. And he calls me up. It's about 6 o'clock at night. It's the first day of the Woodstock Festival, and he says, Ventura, this thing. Well, I had a nickname back then, Speedy, or Speed. He says, Speedy, this thing, people are going to be talking about this because 500,000 people showed up to this concert. And it was big news all over the country. So people are going to be talking about this for the rest of our lives. So we should go. And he said, meet me. He was a bouncer at Flushing Meadow Park, which was about 2 hours on trains and buses from where I was in the Bronx. He said, meet me when I get off work, which was at 2 in the morning, and we'll drive up. Now, he had a Saab, a little car. Most American cars in 1968, big cars. This Saab was a little car and had front-wheel drive, which meant you didn't get stuck so much in mud or grass or stuff like that. And we called it his burro, and his little donkey. And I get on the subway, blah, 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 blah. In those days, I don't know, I don't ever remember being tired. And staying up all night was easy. And so we got in this car, and we drove north. It wasn't that far, Woodstock, 45 minutes, 50 minutes. Now, there had been an enormous traffic jam of all these people getting to Woodstock. The only way you could get there was by car. And there were abandoned cars for 2 or 3 miles before you got to the place where it actually was. Abandoned cars just off the highway, on the highway, and Duke, driving his little burro, would be in and out of all these parked cars. And we we got to within a mile and a half of the bandstand, and it was dark. We had flashlights, we had water. We were older than most of the people there. I was still 23. This was in August. I was still 23. I would turn 24 at the end of October. Duke was 20. If I was 23, he was 21. And most of the people there were younger than us, of the audience. So we got closer and closer. And we get there just as the sun is coming up. First it was light, and then we get there on the hill above the bandstand just as the sun is coming up. And the sun comes straight down on Grace Slick, who is in a sequined pantsuit. So the sun is shining blindingly on her. It hurts to look at her. And she opens up with the band's first song, whatever it was. And that was the way to get to Woodstock. It was just amazing. Everybody woke up along the people sleeping in the hills and stuff. And there we were at Woodstock. And it is not, there are things the documentary and the histories leave out. And the biggest thing that they leave out is, now, we've been watching for a few hours. There have been a bunch of people. It's been great. The music's been great. But there's all these people there. There's not enough latrines. The people are all who had brought their own food. There's a pile, an enormous stack of garbage right in front of the stage. And we got down to be near the front of the stage to see and hear better. And the stench from the garbage was overpowering. I don't know how the people were handling it, unless they were all high. The people right around it. But we went back up the hill to get away from the stench. It was incredible. Now, I don't know any other account of Woodstock except some things that I've written that tell you about the stench.
Maybe that was
how
how
legend.
They were trying to keep people away from the stage. Maybe.
That's very possible. They succeeded in our case. And it's funny because later on, in the 80s, many of the people I met had been at Woodstock. When you met Jeff Nightbird and Jay Levin and Mayor Vishner, John Densmore, the Doors didn't play at Woodstock, but he was there. Jan's best friend, who lived in San Diego, I can't remember her name. She was on the cover of, she was one of the naked girls on the cover of the Woodstock album. But that was later on. The kids I knew in high school were at Woodstock, though. I didn't see them. One was at the Hog Farm, a guy who'd been in our folk singing group, Mark. And so there we were. And the day went on. It rained. Duke and I went down to the pond. And on our way, 3 naked guys are just walking toward us. And I'm a New York City kid. Duke's a New York City kid. We're used to naked people just walking around. We are not from California. And it was like, what is going on here? And they were just walking nonchalantly naked. And, when we were going to the pond, we didn't know we were going to see a lot of naked people there. And it just struck me. These were nice middle-class kids. You could see that. This was the big turnout of nice suburban kids. And here they were walking around naked. I mean, the strictures of society hadn't lasted for 24 hours. But suddenly it's okay to walk around naked. That really struck me. I don't know if it's a great big thought or not, but it really struck me that the society just kind of disappeared. In less than 24 hours, it's okay to walk around naked. And there was no violence has ever been reported about that. about that concert, and there was certainly no violence that we witnessed of any kind. People didn't steal stuff from each other. They tried to help each other. All that part of it was real. I was there. It was real. And we get to the pond, and now the Army had started coming in. The Army helicopters were buzzing the pond, because these are all draftees who were on their way to Vietnam, you know. The Army helicopters were buzzing the pond, looking at the naked girls, and the naked girls were flapping their breasts and waving back, and everybody had a smile on their face. And Duke went in. He took off his clothes and went in, and I just couldn't do it. I'm too inhibited to do that. I'm just a Sicilian street kid. We don't walk around naked. And the other thing that's not in the legend so much is here's these people that are calling the cops pigs, and it's against the war, of course. You know, songs against the war. It was the Army and the cops who got them out when they helped them get out of there and through all that, and helped feed them for the next couple of days. It was those choppers coming in. But that's not really so much of the legend. It's one of the paradoxes of, there's always paradoxes, it's one of the paradoxes of Woodstock. But something, it got to be evening, and the latrines were overflowing. And people were just sitting in it. And even sleeping bags and stuff in it. And what I felt like as we left there, because we left way in the morning and we left before Jimi Hendrix. Although sometimes I tell a tall tale that we left after Jimi Hendrix, but actually the truth is, because you get carried away with these things.
Sure.
But I'm trying to keep everything straight here. And the truth is, we left before Jimi Hendrix, just for the record. Some people listen to this say, "That son of a bitch, he said he saw Jimi." No. Got carried away with telling it. I don't do that anymore. But what was clear to me, I looked around and I went, and I wrote these notes at the time. This is not me looking back, and I'm kind of improvising from my notes here. But I wrote these notes at the time because you know me. I always walk around with a notebook in my pocket, and it was this. If these are the people from whom we're expecting a cultural revolution, we're not going to get it. They're sweet, but they're not disciplined. They're not tough, and it takes more than sweet. And I don't mean in a violent way. I'm totally against political violence. I mean just in a determined way, the way Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had the bravery they showed in the civil rights movement. But that wasn't in this group.
Yeah.
It was a whole different thing. That said, and moving on to the next real big event, how and why I was then living in upstate New York is a little too long for this, but by the fall, Duke and I moved out of New York. I couldn't go work that 9-to-5 job anymore. I've been working 9 to 5 since I was 18. I was about to turn 24, and I was exhausted mentally in every other kind of way with the responsibilities that I'd had. And Duke found us a place, and not very upstate, Rhinebeck, outside of Rhinebeck, New York, a house in the woods. morally impossible not to go. You had to at least stand with the people who were doing the protesting, stand with the people who were risking jail by burning their draft cards. I'd had a hardship deferment, so I wasn't draftable during most of those years because I was essential to my family. But a lot of people I know, especially people who were poor, guys who were poor, friends of my brother's, they went, and some of them didn't come back. And you had to, I felt, it was a moral imperative to go to some demonstrations, but I wasn't enthusiastic about it. But then Kent State and the National Guard had shot and killed peaceful college demonstrators. And yes, some people may have been throwing stuff, but they shot and killed them. Nobody was shooting at them. And to this day, nobody admits who gave the order, who shot first. But there's going to be a big Washington demonstration. And we felt like we had to go. If people were shooting at us, that's the time to show up. And to say, that's not going to scare us off. And we drove down to Dukesboro, but then he taught me how to drive as well. And several of us in that little car. And I remember a moment, frightening moment. I thought I would not be susceptible to crowd lust, so to speak, crowd think, crowd emotion. I thought I'd be above that. But we're walking toward, in this massive bunch of people, and I was toward the front of the enormous crowd, toward the White House, which was rimmed with buses and a lot of Army. I don't think they were National Guard. I think they were Army. And most of them were draftees too. A lot of contradiction, a lot of paradox in all this. It wasn't simple. And the crowd was chanting and blah, 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 and like that. And there was a good-looking blonde woman on the shoulders of a tall guy. And she didn't know it. But when she'd start chanting something, because she was the most visible person in that whole big part of the crowd, everybody around her started chanting the same thing. She didn't know she was leading this thing. But suddenly, she was its focal point. And when she started chanting something, the chant got picked up all along the way. And the soldiers were there, and she's doing these chanting, and the emotions getting up. And I remember saying to the dude, if she says charge these people, I'm going to do it. And he said, yes, so am I. It was that big a thing. And suddenly she turned around and looked and realized the incredible thing that was happening to her. And she slid off. I wasn't close enough to really see her expression in detail, but I did see her face, and she slid off that guy's shoulders in a minute. And I realized, my God, I was ready to do something, let's just say, unthought out. Because of the crowd feeling that this had engendered in me. Man, never again. Not that I'd never go to a demonstration again, but I'd always be on guard because I realized I wasn't above it. Then the tear gas started happening, and everybody started running all over the place. And I got disconnected from Duke, I remember. But one of the great things about growing up in New York is that in that era, you're always in a crowd, is if the crowd starts really moving in a way you don't want to move, just get your back up against the wall and keep it there. And so that's what I did until things calmed down a little. And then made my way. I don't know how I found Duke, but it did. still trying to figure out who I am. I mean, I'm only 24 years old. 68. I turned 23, 69. I wasn't 24 yet. And no, this is 70. It was early 70s, so I was 24. Spring of 70. And without going into too much detail that isn't sort of historical, I wound up in Boston, worked for a while, paid off some debts, and then finally was going to go west, but I left something out. So I got to go back to Radio City Musical in the cellar of the skyscraper, because considering that I made my bones as a film critic and a film writer later, much more film critic than film writer, but something happened when I got the new job that's near the Museum of Modern Art, so we're doubling back here, but that's okay. And it was that I was a typesetter, and the first thing they'd give me to typeset, and typesetting isn't like a typewriter keyboard. You have the typewriter keyboard, but all around that you have a whole other bank of keys, 3 or 4 keys deep, rows deep. And those keys are commands to this computer on a perforated tape. It's all on a perforated tape that you're typing on a page. And commands to the computer of how to set the type. Because this was a brand new technology at the time. The computer, which was very stupid, was a whole cellar wall of flashing lights like you see in the movies. And yet all it could do was set type. And the first thing they gave me to set was a directory of the soft drink industry. This means a telephone book of names, addresses, and phone numbers of soft drink companies and companies that service soft drink companies, trucking companies, all these things. So, and I was in a small room with, I can't tell you how many shoe boxes of file cards in alphabetical order of soft drink company information.
Oh,
I
man.
sent that whole phone book. Now, some people listening to this don't know what a phone book is.
Yeah.
A phone directory is a great big thick book. Usually has 4 columns, sometimes 5 columns of print, a page, usually on thin yellow paper. They would call it the yellow pages. And each tiny entry in small type is a name, a number, and dot, 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 dot across the margin to a phone number. And that was the directory. And it took me a couple of months of just doing that for 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
But the next assignment I got, because I was good at what I did, the next assignment I got was the Janus film catalog.
Oh, wow.
Now, in those days, if you went to an arts theater, or what we call them revival theaters, art theaters, whatever you want to call them,
Yeah.
most of the films
Right.
were rented from Janus.
Yeah.
And Janus had 35 millimeter prints, but also 16 millimeter prints, like for camps and such. More informal settings, it was 16 millimeter prints.
Right.
But 35 millimeter prints for the theaters of all the good old films, all the good foreign films. Even now, you're watching TCM or something, you'll see Janus, the Janus emblem on them. There's still a Janus, and they still have a catalog. And I typeset that catalog. Now, and I typeset all of it. That was my assignment, my baby. And now before this, I've been very, very involved with motion pictures since I was 7 years old, because in New York City, there were shows every Saturday where you paid a quarter, and I'm serious. You paid a quarter, you got 10 cents to get in, 10-cent bag of popcorn, 5-cent Coke, and you were all set. And or 5-cent candy or 10-cent candy. You went in with 50 cents and you just gorged if you could get the 50 cents together. And they'd have 10 cartoons and a Western and a war movie and a monster movie, sci-fi movie, or some combination thereof. And the program would go on for like 6 hours. And that's what you did on Saturdays. And this was neighborhood theater after neighborhood theater all over the city. Now, the features they'd show weren't necessarily new features, because this was for the kids. This was Westerns and monster pictures and war pictures. And they'd show some great stuff, in between the cartoons. They also showed newsreels. And the newsreel, what was most exciting was you'd see the atomic bomb tests. And you'd be in those movie theaters and you'd see these atomic bomb tests and realize that the duck and cover drills you were doing at school were just nonsense. Grown-ups were lying about that too. But I've been involved in movies since that age. I've been looking at TV for old movies, looking at movies. They were a big part of my mental and emotional life. But I always figured them as a kind of another form of life running alongside our form of life. I don't mean that I took them literally or seriously, but in my imagination, they really were another form of life to me. I never thought about them being directed. I never thought about them being written. It never occurred to me, even as I got older. I didn't experience them that way. I didn't think about Audrey Hepburn as an actress. I thought about her as a being from another world that I just wanted to be in the same room with. It's okay if it was a theater. And there was breakfast at Tiffany's, and I thought, oh my God, I never knew there was a human being like that in this world. I never saw one. Where would I get to see an Audrey Hepburn? Kind of thing. And I loved the Westerns. I loved their vistas. I'd never seen such a vista. I would eventually, but never had. And here I was, and there was a good paragraph or so analyzing each movie in the sense of who directed it, why it was considered important. There was a cast list, a director's list, crew list, and a photograph. And I finally learned the movies were directed. I'd kind of known it. I knew, for instance, of Fellini. It was a special kind of movie, directed by this guy Fellini. And they weren't like anybody else's pictures. But it wasn't as obvious with the American pictures. And really my movie education, besides having seen so many movies, was typesetting the Janus film catalog. I believe it was the spring of 1970. It was an amazing experience. It opened my eyes. It was like a whole film school wrapped into one, because I'd seen so many of the movies on TV. Because that's the other thing. And New York City had 7 television channels, which was way more than anywhere else in the world. And 3 of them were independent stations that showed mostly movies. So you got a chance to see a lot of movies if you were a New Yorker who liked movies. And plus, they had the theater called the New Yorker up in the West 80s, the West 90s. They had a theater in the Village called the Bleecker Street. They had another, I can't remember what it was called. It's the one you see in Woody Allen's Annie Hall in the West Village. And so there was this enormous opportunity to see movies, and it was very, very expensive. I mean, you didn't pay $1 for a movie ticket until the mid-'60s. And in the revival theaters and those things, you didn't pay $1, you paid 50 cents, something like that, while I was there. And a pack of cigarettes cost 35 cents, 40 cents. It was a very different world. And my writing, how I looked at life, that just opened this door, typesetting this film catalog. And in terms of what we're talking about, I guess it's an important thing to include. I didn't want to forget to include it.
Yeah.
Because it was strange how I found if I was open to something, usually my interest would take me down odd ways to get there, but I'd get there. I'd learn about it. And when I realized that what I was typesetting, when I realized this wasn't just anything, this was a real chance at an education, not only in and of itself, but in pointing me in a direction of where to look and what to read, how to do it, what other people thought were important, what other people thought was important. And so there I was a working stiff, but just a trick of fate, I was getting the education I needed for as a foundation for what I was going to do later, and I had no idea, because I didn't say to myself, I'm going to be a film critic. I didn't say to myself, I'm going to write films. I had no idea that life was going to take me that way. I was just trying to get through the day, try to write some poems at night. And then I guess we begin with the next chapter, because then I went west.
There's a couple of things that I wanted to ask you about, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
One of them is the music scene in New York at that time, jazz and folk music, and just wondering if you could just give a kind of a feeling of what your relation was to that and how you experienced that.
Interesting. It's a good question. The thing is about poverty is you don't know what's there.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful film called The Cool World, an independent film by a woman whose name has just left my mind. That's one of the things about being my age. Oh, damn it. Shirley Clark. She and John Cassavetes were the first people to make really significant independent films totally without the studios. And Shirley Clark made a film called The Cool World, which was built upon a novel of the same name. And it's not in the novel, but it is in the film, that there's a girl in East Harlem, or maybe Harlem, Afro-American girl, and she wants to see the sea. And she doesn't know, because it's poverty, there's no way for her to know, that the subway she takes to work every day, she just takes it to the end of the line. It'll take her to Coney Island or the sea. And in very much the same way, I had jazz records. I loved jazz when I was 15. But I didn't know until late in my stay in New York that the people I was playing, Miles Davis and John Coltrane, and Charlie Mingus, that for not much of a cover charge, I could see them play live in Greenwich Village just about any day of the week. I got to it toward the very end of my stay in New York, when I saw Miles Davis at the Village Gate, Village Vanguard. I saw Charlie Mingus. I didn't see Coltrane. I saw some others. I was much more interested in that than in the folk scene. And also, I was working 9 to 5. You don't have a whole lot of time to go gallivanting.
Yeah.
And when I did, I usually went to the museums. But I saw some of that. I could have seen more. I could have seen more theater. But I really really didn't know it was as accessible as it was. I didn't guess it, and I had no way to find out. I just didn't luck upon it.
Yeah.
That wasn't my thing. Any other question?
Yeah. There's a couple more things. During that time, it seems like New York goes through a kind of it kind of transforms itself into what it became in the 70s, which, I mean, from what I've seen, it like crime goes way up. Drugs become a lot more a part of the atmosphere. It seems as though it becomes more unpredictable on the street. Kind of wilder, more spontaneous acts of violence, things like that. And I guess I'm asking you, how did you experience that? Like, what do you think were causes behind that transformation of like you were talking about how there was in the 65 blackout there was this sense of community, right? And it reminded me of the way that LA was before maybe 84, 85. Like I felt like things really changed in Los Angeles because we just had this avalanche one day of immigration that wasn't able to assimilate over time, and it kind of atomized the city, and it became like little Armenia and little Thailand, and whereas before there wasn't as many little pockets, and they all were kind of cooperating in this like Los Angeles community. It was a really viciously segregated city, but at the same time there was a sense of us working together. Like people would say hi to each other on the street. There was just more of a positive vibe about it, and it kind when you talked about New York, it kind of reminded me of that. And yeah, I just wondering if you could talk to that, like maybe the loss of trust, the loss of that kind of community. And I mean, like you could compare the 65 blackout to the what was it, 78 or 77 blackout, you know, and the reactions.
77.
Yeah.
Well, I left New York City for keeps.
Right.
In 69.
Yeah.
Late 69. But I kept going back there through mid 72. And it did change. I know from my mother living in the Bronx, her existence became much more precarious. The neighborhood became much more dangerous. She had to be much more careful. As I said, I think in one of these, you know, we live right in the neighborhood where The Wanderers was shot. It was filmed. I don't want to get it mixed up. And it was much like that, but it also was turning into something else. I remember being on the phone with my mother, and I said, which was rare because long-distance calls were expensive, but it must have been Mother's Day or something. I was in Austin by that time, and I said, well, how's the neighborhood, Ma? And she said, oh, our street is good. Another lady got killed on the next street, but our street is fine. You know, which was just delusional. You know, but it's the kind of story you tell yourself just to make yourself stay sane. You know, so in the sense of, I mean, she knew better. She's a very smart woman, but that's the kind of thing you say to yourself.
Yeah.
Just so you can walk out the door. So in that period, which is a pretty short period, between the 77 blackout was a riot, basically.
Right.
You know, it was things burning down. It was totally different from something that had happened just 8 years earlier, 9 years earlier. I think a big thing, the major thing in New York, where the immigration had been going on forever, waves of immigrants.
Right.
And the latest waves were from Puerto Rico, and they were no more disruptive than the Italians. And where the pockets had been there always, the Italian neighborhood, the Irish neighborhood, the Jewish neighborhood, the Puerto Rican neighborhood, black neighborhood. But the biggest thing in the neighborhoods was two. One, with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, the black middle class that had always been the backbone of Harlem and of Bed-Stuy, the church middle class that was the backbone of the civil rights movement in the South. In the East, in the big cities, they were able to move to the suburbs like everybody else.
Huh. Yeah.
And that took the backbone out. That took the people who created the order in the community out. At the same time, the drugs came in like they'd never been before. Post about 1966, people started being able to make a lot of money dealing drugs. And this also completely corrupted the New York City Police Department for about 10 years. You know, Serpico,
Right.
that's that time.
Right.
And you know, that's a very true story. I should just say true. There's either true or not true. That's a true story. and where you had a very corrupt police department, you had an incredibly corrupt construction business, where there were corners cut all over the place. You look at that whole period in New York, not one of those buildings is a building I trust, no matter how fancy it is. The corruption in the construction business, the docks had always been corrupt, and several corruptions in New York City anyway, crisscrossed. The police corruption, the drug corruption, the beginnings of gangs, because the impulse was to keep order on your block.
Yeah.
If nobody else was going to. And so in New York anyway, because I didn't get to L.A. until 78, when L.A. was a kind of dead town. But in New York, it was basically the drugs and the African American middle class moving to what they could afford, and the backbone of the social fabric in those places wasn't there anymore, and things got chaotic for a while, a good long while.
So the Puerto Ricans don't show up until like 65, 66?
Oh no, the Puerto Rican.
Okay.
No, Italian Harlem turned into Spanish Harlem by the late 1950s.
Okay.
East Harlem was Puerto Ricans were firmly there. West Side Story, the
Right.
musical.
Okay. Yeah.
That's they called it West Side Story when the West 80s were the dangerous part of the area, because the Italians and the Puerto Ricans were fighting. That's what West Side Story is all about. And so date whenever West Side Story is, because it was old news by the time West Side Story was on. So you're looking at the late 50s, mid to late 50s, the Puerto Rican wave starts.
Yeah.
And continues, you know. I mean, and what we must always remember with the Puerto Rican wave is those people are American citizens.
Right. Right.
Puerto Rico is not a foreign country, and of course, as you know, they came here and were not treated like American citizens. So that was those were some, what I've just mentioned was some of the underpinnings of any kind of sense of order there in New York City. I lived in Boston, 71, 72, And the same thing wasn't happening up there to that extent. Boston went crazy when busing started going in. The Irish and the Italian Catholics just weren't really nuts with it.
Right. And then I was wondering if the RFK assassination had any kind of impact on you, if you had any strong memories of that.
You know, that one kind of passed me by.
Yeah.
It happened about 2 months after King.
Right.
And I was ambivalent about Robert Kennedy from the get-go. I've read more about the Kennedys than I'd like to have read. I don't like them much. But I believe he was sincerely wounded and affected by his brother's death. I think he sincerely wanted to make a difference. But I also think, given the way he conducted that campaign and the way he exposed himself, there was a craziness there in him, as well as I'm not saying I don't think he wanted to die.
Right.
But I think he felt he had to expose himself.
Yeah.
And his lack of security got ridiculous. If you read about his campaign, you just go, "Oh my God, kidding, man!" But it didn't affect me personally. I remember the campaign when he became senator, and in fact, I saw him campaigning one day on the street, and I thought, "Oh my God, there's Bobby Kennedy. He's just a person, isn't he?" And I respected his platform. I think a much more important and an enormous figure of that time, certainly the most important white guy of that time, was Lyndon Johnson, who, on the one hand, in domestic politics and domestic policy, was brilliant. No other president has passed such momentous, long-living, beneficial legislation, Medicare, Medicaid, Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act. Those things alone, just incredibly momentous. Old people without Medicare, it would be an atrocity in this country now. And Medicaid, some kind of medical help for the poor, didn't exist. Let people rot. Though it was dismantled under the Obama administration, ironically enough, the Voting Rights Act was huge. It changed the face of the South. And so on the one hand, you have that. On the other hand, you had a president with no international cred, in the sense of he didn't know his way around that. He had no geopolitical expertise. He was intimidated by the military. The way JFK was intimidated by the military. The military couldn't intimidate Eisenhower. He knew them all. and he'd been their commanding officer. And he knew when they were bullshitting. When they told him to go into Vietnam, when his advisors were telling him to go into Vietnam, Eisenhower sent General Ridgway, a general he trusted, a combat general he trusted, one of the best American generals of the mid-20th century. And Ridgway came back and told him, you need 500,000 guys there, and you could only keep it while they were there. As soon as they leave, it's gone. And so he didn't get into it, though he had enormous pressure to get into it. Kennedy was more intimidated by them, Johnson was completely intimidated by them. And the big figure there was Johnson, and the big failure, I believe, and I believe this is, again, I promise you, cross my heart and spit, this is not retrospective. I thought this at the time. In 68, no, it was 72, I voted for McGovern, for Humphrey, rather. No, 68. I voted for Humphrey. And it was the one time the left had a decisive deciding factor. If they had voted for him, he was an old-timey politician, and he would have owed them, and he would have recognized that, and he would have done something with it. Nothing miraculous, but something real. And the left could have gotten a foothold in real government instead of just blab. But the left was too immature, as usual, and didn't do it, and let Nixon win. And they went to party, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Okay, well, why don't we wrap it up there?
Okay. That's good.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks a lot.
I'm glad you dug it. Interesting going back to those memories. Sorry I'm not more linear than I could be.
No, it was perfect.